position of saying, it's not our senses that we can trust, but it's our rationality. These clear and distinct perceptions that we have of God, of 2 plus 2 equals 4, of things like that. He says that's what leads us to knowledge, and that's what justifies us. And this is actually comes to be known as, in a position in epistemology, known as foundationalism. So we start with a foundation, like I think, therefore I am, and then we build our knowledge claims up from this particular foundation. So that's what Descartes' up to in the first meditation, first and second meditation. And then we moved on to Bishop Berkeley and his short article on colors, which is a dialogue between Philonous and Hylas. And as I mentioned, Philonous means, in Greek, it means the love of mind, and Hylas means matter. So in colors, Berkeley, through Philonous, starts out asking, do we say that colors actually exist in objects? And he starts off talking about clouds. And Hylas is like, yeah, sure, objects exist, colors exist in objects. And he talks about the clouds, and he says, we see them from a distance, and they're this beautiful red and this beautiful purple. But when we get a lot closer to those clouds, we realize that they're just gray mist. So it doesn't seem like, so there's the distance, right? So it seems like when we view objects from different distances, the colors tend to change. So it doesn't seem, right to say that the color exists in the object. Furthermore, Berkeley goes on to say, well, we can even look at something through a microscope. And if we look at something through a microscope, we see it very differently. Something that may appear brilliant red, to the naked eye, if you look at it under a microscope, it might be white or something like that. And then he goes into his small animals or insects, whatever you prefer, and he says, do you assume that small animals can see smaller than we can? Because he says it's the argument essentially is we can see things smaller than we can because that's what allows us to survive in our environment. And it seems crazy to assume that smaller animals or insects don't have the same capacity. And if that's the case, then they see things smaller than we do, and they probably see things differently than we do. So the idea is this whole idea of perspective, right? Like things viewed from different perspectives appear differently to different people. And Berkeley, he has this principle where he says that real properties do not admit of change without the bodies changing themselves. And it appears, as we've seen with colors, if you view it from different perspectives, it appears that colors actually change, so therefore colors are not real properties. Now this also brings me back to the distinction that I made in the beginning of class between primary and secondary qualities. So Locke makes this distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and in many ways Berkeley is responding to Locke, and he's responding to Descartes as well. And so primary qualities for Locke are things like extension, shape, motion, things like that. Whereas secondary qualities are these things that Berkeley appears to be talking about, like colors, smells, sounds, things that are dependent upon our perception or the configuration of the primary qualities in order to exist. But remember that Berkeley actually wants to obliterate this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. And he wants to say, well, if you can buy my argument that color is not a primary quality, or it's not a real quality because it changes depending on perspective, then why can't we make this exact same argument about primary qualities? Things like size and shape and motion. Because we look at things from the perspective of our naked eye, and they're one size, they're one shape, the motion, maybe it's not even moving at all. But yet if we look at something under a microscope or at the nano level or the quantum level or whatever, it's quite different than what it appears to us in the naked eye. So it seems like if you accept this premise, which I think is a contestable and contentious premise, that real properties do not admit of change without the bodies changing, that's the real premise that's doing the work in Berkeley's argument. And if you agree to that, then you end up in this position where it seems like you can't even say that primary qualities are real, according to Berkeley's definition of real. And that leads Berkeley into his famous position of immaterialism, where he actually says that material things don't exist at all. They only exist as concepts in our minds. So essentially, Berkeley ends up in this sort of weird position where the two things that exist in Berkeley's universe are spirits. So we're considered as spirits, and concepts or ideas. And of course, the great spirit that animates it all is God. And we're all sort of concepts within the mind of God. And then you have these other things like humans and things like that that are spirits that can also perceive, but at a much lesser or lower level than God can perceive. So that's essentially what you have left. And as I said, Berkeley actually saw this. He thought this was a common sense position because he didn't think it made sense to say that things like colors and that don't exist. But he realized the problems that Descartes had brought up with skepticism and the distinctions, that some of the distinctions and problems that Locke had brought up as well. And he saw that if you're going to say that those things are material things, yeah, then you're in a pickle. But Berkeley's way out of this pickle, and some people say he's developed a very elegant and sophisticated argument for this, and he has, is to say that there are no material things at all, and that these things do exist, but they just exist as ideas in our mind or within the minds of God. So that's it for this week, or this past week's review, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. If you have any questions about the paper topics that I've posted, feel free to shoot me an email. Have a good one.